Good morning. It's great to be here. My name's Dan Gould. Obviously, this is Maureen Weiss somewhere behind me. We're going to do sort of a tag team approach today. So one of us will be up, the other will come up. Hopefully, that's not too awkward. As you can see and heard, our task is to discuss the current state of youth sports. And what we really want to focus, like all of us here, to help our country develop a national youth sports strategy. Our beginning speakers clearly laid out that path. A strategy that promotes more kids involved in youth sports. But the second point here is important as well, a strategy that maximizes the benefits and minimizes the detriments. Just getting more kids to play sport won't necessarily solve the problem. There's research that shows that some kids don't meet physical activity guidelines if it's not coached well. So those two need to go together. As was mentioned, there's some challenges anytime you try to do a big innovation like this. And the first is, Katrina mentioned, how do we define sport? What are the ages? We used to think 18 and under, but now some of the research on young adulthood says the brain's not fully fused. Are they included? Structure. What about playing sport in the backyard versus do you need an organized competition, scheduled practices? So I think we need to operationalize that. Secondly, we need to understand the complex and fragmented nature of youth sports in the USA. It's almost impossible to get something to everybody. There's a baseball organization of baseball organizations, and the national governing body in baseball has other organizations that are not affiliated with them. It's a very complex and fragmented system. It's our system and we have to deal with it, but we just need to recognize that. Third, Maureen will cover this in a second. To see where to go in the future, maybe we need to look at the past and have a brief review of the history of youth sports in our country. And finally, we need to look at the current status and, of youth sports and critical issues. Now today, we use a variety of sources of knowledge to put our presentations together. First, we use scholarly articles, research articles like one by Dunn, correlated the amount of money parents pay for sport and the pressure kids feel and the enjoyment they get. With the more money parents paid, the more kids felt pressured in youth sports. So we looked at individual studies like that. Review articles, one that I put a couple of ours up here, but we looked at many other authors' review articles in the area. Third, position papers, a variety of groups, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, looked at other countries, the Canadian Physical Literacy Consensus Statement on sports specialization, concussions, coaching, a variety of issues. Finally, we'll have a speaker today from Project Play, the Aspen Institute. Their whole scheme, Emily will talk about how they're trying to reimagine sport, youth sports, and they'll talk about their 8 plays, their 8 big strategies. We looked at that. And finally, our experience with our own partners, mine with the Detroit Police Athletic League, Maureen Weiss with the Girls on the Run, the First Tee, various groups. What we learned from being in the trenches day to day that you might not pick up in the research studies. Finally, I should mention my day job is I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Youth Sport. This is our 41st year of existence. We were started by the state legislature in Michigan to scientifically study the benefits and detriments of sport for children and youth, and then work with partners around the state to maximize the benefits, minimize the detriments. So that's what we focus on. So let me turn it over to Maureen, who will talk now about the National Academy and give us the history.
Good morning. So I'm here representing the National Academy of Kinesiology, which is an organization of elected scholars who have made leading contributions to scientific research, educational applications, and community outreach in sport as well as physical activity. This includes the study of the social, psychological, and physiological benefits of sport and physical activity, as well as efforts to reduce barriers and health disparities faced by underrepresented youth. We publish a journal, Kinesiology Review, consisting of articles taking a multidisciplinary approach to critical issues in sports, such as the effects of early sport specialization and concussion management in sport. So, as Dan mentioned, it's important to understand where organized youth sports started from. The evolution goes back well over 100 years. And so by looking at how views have changed over time, it helps us understand where we are today and the possibilities of making a difference. So the YMCA is here. The YMCA actually started before the 20th century and was instrumental in promoting a philosophy called muscular Christianity, whereby organized sports served as a vehicle for socializing youth, especially immigrant youth, into American life, primarily for boys. At the same time, in the early 20th century, educators in health, physical education, and recreation were denouncing competitive school sports, critical of the overemphasis on winning, inadequate coaching, and overzealous parents. And this led actually to the elimination of inter-school athletic competitions in the early part of the 20th century. This provided the impetus for the emergence of privately sponsored youth sport programs like we have today. And at that time, the first ones to emerge included organizations such as Little League Baseball and Pop Warner Football. Well, the 1950s led to establishing the President's Council on Youth Fitness by then President Eisenhower. That was prompted by scientific findings of very poor physical fitness among boys in preparing for the military in the midst of the Cold War. JFK, of course, continued the impetus and was very committed to the nation's sport and fitness. And every other president, of course, has followed suit, as we see here today. Of course, the council has changed names quite a few times. When we look at race, gender, and the Special Olympics, of all the privately sponsored youth sports programs, Little League Baseball, founded in 1939, became the most popular among the American public, perhaps because baseball has always been noted as the national pastime. However, Little League was primarily for white boys and did not even allow African American boys to play on integrated teams until passage of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. And even in the South, African American boys were still not afforded full access until the tail end of the civil rights movement. This is quite remarkable because, as we know, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947. Girls of all races and ethnicities were deprived of participating in organized sports programs, and it wasn't until 1974, 2 years after passage of Title IX, that Little League was mandated to include girls through a Supreme Court mandate. I want to mention that former Senator Birch Bayh, who championed and authored Title IX, actually died 3 weeks ago today. And Title IX is a prime example of how the government can make a difference in the area of youth sports. The Special Olympics, serving youth as well as adults with intellectual disabilities, was started as a camp in the early 1960s by Eunice Kennedy Shriver and just celebrated its 50th anniversary of its international games and has been a champion of increasing physical activity among individuals with disabilities. So the 1970s saw a surge in studies on the effects of youth sport on health and well-being. As Dan mentioned, the state of Michigan legislative studies led to the formation of the Institute for the Study of Youth Sports in 1978. Numerous conferences and workshops on the social, psychological, and physiological effects of youth sports started emerging. For example, one by the American Orthopedic Society for Sports Medicine in 1990, and this is the compendium of articles that were produced as a result of that conference. AFERD, or the American Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance, which was and still is the primary professional association for sport and physical activity practitioners, established this task force through the National Association of Sport and Physical Education. And Reiner Martens and Vern Seefeld drafted the Bill of Rights for young athletes. So these Bill of Rights for young athletes were promoted exactly 4 years ago. And as you kind of scan through these Bill of Rights, you can see that things like the right to have qualified adult leadership, the right to play as a child and not as an adult, the right to participate in safe and healthy environments, reflect a philosophy of youth sport participation compatible with the very reason that we're here today, to develop a strategy for youth sports that maximizes the benefits and minimizes the barriers to youth sports participation. So this might be a nice Bill of Rights to kind of revisit for the draft report. Since the increased academic interest in youth sports in the 1970s, numerous research and professional publications have emerged. There are just too many to list. But Reiner Martens' Joy and Sadness in Children's Sport in 1978 and Shane Murphy's The Cheers and the Tears in 1999 have titles that reflect the potential for both the benefits as well as the detriments of youth sports. It's not an automatic consequence. The benefits are not an automatic consequence of mere participation. So in summary, that was a very brief historical review. I based the information on noted sport historian David Wiggins, important to understand. But clearly there's been a long-standing belief that sport contributes to the healthy skill development and well-being of young people. There are massive numbers of youth playing sport in and after school, and these youth vary in demographic characteristics, gender, race, ethnicity, culture, and so forth. Most parents and caregivers are very supportive and believe that sports can really help their children. And of course, our society places great value on, and sometimes an obsession with the importance of sports to make a difference. Okay, back to Dan. Oops, I'm sorry.
We'll be tag teaming so you can hold the applause. So, and I won't get any, so that's another reason. Let's talk about briefly the benefits and detriments of youth sport participation. This is something that's been looked at in the literature over the years. A number of review articles have looked at it, and I've kind of broken into two categories: physical or sort of skill benefits and social and psychological benefits. And this is not a complete list, just sort of an example here, but we have under the physical side, fundamental movement skills, physical proficiency. Things that we've actually seen fallen off, and why the Marines and the Army are very concerned that recruits don't come in with those basic skills. Increased physical activity and cardiovascular and muscular fitness benefits. The physical activity guidelines talk, Russ Pate and others will talk about those. Less body fat, lower risk of diabetes, increased bone mineral content and density. So we have a list of things of this nature. The social psychological, just the sheer enjoyment of sport. Perceived competence, confidence, self-esteem, any of the aliases have all been looked at through sport involvement. Social skills, teamwork, leadership, and then various life skills, some of which I've listed here. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is there's also been detriments noted in the literature. And again, I broke it down into two general categories. Acute injuries. Today, especially overuse injuries are tied to sports specialization. Bell and others have linked that in high school athletes. Concussions, heat issues over the years. On the social psychological side, some of the potential detriments: increased anxiety and stress of children by being socially evaluated, and in some cases leading to burnout. Secondly, decreased perceptions of competence, so opposite of the benefits. Decreased motivations, lower levels of moral functioning. Some research shows the longer individuals are in sport, the lower their level of moral functioning goes. So the idea that sport builds character might not always be the case. Benefits versus detriments. What's the bottom line? Well, first, most reviewers conclude, if you look at the literature, the benefits probably outweigh the detriments overall. However, if you dig deeper, beneficial effects are not an automatic byproduct of participation that Maureen just outlined. And the third point is probably the most important. Beneficial effects are more likely to occur when intentional efforts are ensured for quality programming, quality coaching, and parent and peer involvement. Studies that we've looked at, you amplify the benefits with a caring relationship created by the coach, with better peer support, a motivational climate that focuses on individual improvement versus outcome. So these effects get amplified, the positive effects. So the way we're going to approach this today for the rest of the presentation, given that youth sports is a complex system, we thought we probably needed to look at the literature and the guidelines perhaps that way. So we took a very simple systems model. If we start at the individual level, what's happening with the child in sport? Physically, socially, psychologically. Then we go to maybe the immediate sport environment. Maureen will talk about coaches, parents, peers. And then I'll come back and talk about larger cultural issues that might be involved and social issues that have an influence. So again, sort of a Bronfenbrenner bioecological model in a very simplified form. The way we'll actually attack it then, Maureen will talk about the individual participation motives and outcome. She'll then pivot into influence of significant others and peers in the sport environment. And then again, I'll come back in cultural and societal influences.
Perfect. See, this is a team sport as well, this tag team. So this is going to be a very brief and quick review of the literature on participation motivation and then the role of coaches, parents, and peers. So the topic of participation motivation addresses the reasons that children and adolescents state why they're involved in sport and physical activity. Understanding their motives for participation is important so that we can best meet their needs and interests and keep them involved in sport and physical activity. So many descriptive studies in the 1980s surveyed children and adolescents about why they participate. And some of the common reasons for participating included improving skills, being with friends, and having fun, while reasons for dropping out of sport included not having fun, not improving or being good enough, and disliking the pressure. And many of these studies were done over those years. The compilation of these studies with youth of varying age, gender, sport type, and nationality could be sort of synthesized into three major categories of participation motives. Children want to develop and demonstrate physical competence, develop and affirm social relationships, and to experience enjoyment, not just fun, but also choice and variety of activities, as well as challenging but realistic goals. So these reasons for participation motivation strongly suggest that significant others in the sport environment should strive to enhance feelings of competence, provide opportunity for autonomy or choice, promote positive social relationships, and maximize enjoyment. And in one of the publications we did, we took the first letter of each of those words highlighted in blue, and we get the memorable acronym of CARE, which is also very appropriate. How can we care for our young athletes and keep them involved in sport and physical activity? If we put the puzzle pieces together of what we know about youth motivation, we have here the supportive social environments can help promote care. And as children, enhance in these areas, that should improve self-determined motivation or having internal reasons for being involved in sport. This should increase physical activity, and of course, increased physical activity, as we know, will afford children and adolescents the many holistic benefits that are available from participating in sport and physical activity. So this is just a little visual to put all of that together. So the million-dollar question, of course, is how can significant others in the sport environment promote care in the youth sports setting? Feelings of competence, autonomy, relatedness, enjoyment. So in the next series of slides, I'm going to very briefly review what we know and what some of the gaps are about how coaches, parents, and peers strive to do this. And these are going to be just snapshots due to time, but we'll be happy to answer questions later. So coaches, of course, are critical. What do we know and what do we need to know about how coaches influence young people? So a strong body of literature shows that these particular mechanisms are critical for whether youth experience positive or negative outcomes in sport. The quality of instruction, feedback, interactions, whether coaches emphasize a mastery-oriented climate, which is based on improvement, mastering skills, or an ego-oriented climate in terms of favorable comparison to others or winning. What are some of the gaps? Just a couple. One thing we need to answer, what are the essential elements of coach training to ensure that these mechanisms are understood and translated by volunteer coaches to the sports setting? A second one is, which coach training programs work successfully based on evaluation research, and can these programs then serve as exemplars for others? And we're going to hear about many of these programs today. So lots of gaps, but we do have a strong body of literature on what we do know. So what about parents? Of course, parents and other caregivers provide youth with their first experiences in sport by signing them up and transporting them. And over the last 25 years, the research on parental influence has exploded. And what I've done is I've chosen to visualize the influence through these major pathways. So we know that parents' values and beliefs, such as to what degree do they value physical activity, what are their attitudes about sport ethics, what are their goal orientation, their beliefs influence their behavior toward and with their child, their own activity level, whether they are a parent coach, what kind of opportunities, what kind of support. And so parents' beliefs and behaviors then influence children's beliefs and behaviors, such as children's value toward being physically active, their own goal orientation, gender beliefs, are certain sports for boys or for girls, and of course participation rates and effort. So we have a strong body of literature there. What are some of the gaps? One question is, can educational programs or interventions be effective for helping parents become more supportive and less pressuring in youth sports? Fine line between support and pressure. How can we help parents feel that? A second one is, we know a lot about traditional mother-father middle-class families, but we have so many different variations of family structures, and yet we know very little about those other types of family structures and how that impacts children. If we move to peers, we know that classmates and teammates are a huge source of influence for youth participants. What do we know and what do we need to know? We know that social acceptance by one's peer group and having close, loyal friendships enhance feelings of belonging with and connection to same-age peers. That can translate to greater confidence, motivation, and actual physical activity levels, as well as sport participation. Leadership opportunities for peers enhance feelings of competence and also participation rates. What are some of the gaps? What are some of the best ways for coaches to create a positive, inclusive environment in which peers can accept and appreciate diversity among teammates? A second one might be, how can coaches design practices to ensure that all youth feel a sense of connection to others, feel a sense of psychological safety, and thus want to continue rather than discontinue their sport involvement? So brief summary, we know the quality of coaching, parenting, and peer relationships play a strong role in the outcomes that children have. More research is needed for identifying the mechanisms by which we can maximize the benefits and minimize barriers. And how can we improve the probability that sport delivers on the promise of doing this? I want to move now. We've been talking generically about youth sports programs. It's already been mentioned that definition is a problem. But we certainly know that there are what we might call traditional performance-oriented programs and ones that are more developmental in emphasis. So I want to turn to that now. We have a lack of many developmentally appropriate sports programs with programs that emphasize more of a performance ethic and competitive outcomes. And in these traditional programs, often children are treated as miniature adults, playing with adult equipment and so forth. On an optimistic note, however, change is on the horizon for many programs. USA Ice Hockey and the U.S. Tennis Association have modified their structures to be more child-friendly. They have child-friendly equipment, smaller playing surfaces, modified rules that maximize safety, and they started to de-emphasize competition. If we compare traditional and developmental programs, it looks something like this. They differ in philosophy, holistic outcomes versus performance, curricular focus on physical and life skills versus physical skills and competitive outcomes. They differ in coach training, and they differ in the intention to conduct evaluation to see what's working, what's not working, and how can we improve the experiences of our youth participants. HHS has asked me to talk a little bit about Girls on the Run, which exemplifies a developmental program, more specifically a positive youth development program. Allison Riley is going to go into much more detail about their coach training and recruitment, so I'm just going to give a big picture of how it's a developmental program and a sampling of results from a longitudinal evaluation of impact that we conducted just a couple of years ago. So, in line with being a developmental program, they feature an intentional curriculum of skill-building activities. The 5 C's plus 1 comes from Richard Lerner's child development model. Life skills are emphasized, such as managing emotions and resolving conflict. And activities in the curriculum are designed to teach physical skills, the physical activities and running, and the life skills concurrently in order to maximize the holistic health outcomes that are the goals of the program. The systematic coach training focuses on 3 major concepts: building positive relationships, a positive inclusive environment, and creating a mastery climate. And this circles back exactly to what we know about effective coaching behaviors. So the program has used the evidence base to identify clear features of their coach training program. So we conducted an independent study a few years ago to determine the effectiveness of the program in attaining its goals. I'm going to just share a few results because we have a lot. We have a paper that's published ahead of print in Pediatric Exercise Science. But in the next series of slides, I'm going to show a series of graphs about some outcomes for the full sample of girls in the study, as well as girls who started below the preseason average. So those girls that perhaps need a developmental program the most. So in this first graph, and the scale is from 1 to 4, this is self-report. So for self-esteem, which was the assessment for confidence, we can see that for the full sample, there is a significant but small improvement in self-esteem, perhaps because the scores started out so high. But what we see with the girls who started below the preseason average dramatically improved from pre to postseason and even at follow-up 3 months later. This graph shows perceived classmate support, which was the assessment for connection. And again, we see that there was a significant but smaller increase for the full sample, and this dramatic increase in perceptions of classmate support by the girls who started below the preseason average. So those girls that might be most at risk or most vulnerable to drop out. This one, of course, I'm very excited about physical activity. As was mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of data to show that sport has been successful in meeting the physical activity guidelines. This one we see for the full sample, pretty stable high rates between 4 and 5 days. This is on a number of days per week of doing moderate activity for 60 minutes based on the YRBS from the CDC. But you can see for the girls who started below the preseason average, the increase from pre to postseason was 42% increase, and this was maintained 3 months later. Very exciting information. And then this last graph is from our comparison of girls and Girls on the Run to a comparison group of girls who've never participated in Girls on the Run. The large majority of them participated in traditional sport programs. And this is life skills learning. All of these are significant differences, with Girls on the Run reporting higher scores for life skills learning. And not only are these statistically significant, but they are large effect sizes, which means that they're meaningful differences as well. So in conclusion, we use some rigorous methods to evaluate the program. It required substantial human and financial resources to pull it off. So this is a preview of what I'm going to ask the government to do. But using those methods, we provided strong evidence that the Girls on the Run is making a difference, is effective in promoting positive youth development. And we explain most of the positive findings to the intentional skill-building curriculum and the systematic coach training program. And these program components could serve as exemplars for other programs that are similar to Girls on the Run. Okay, back to Dan.
Okay, let me turn to cultural and social, societal issues now that Maureen has talked about individual level issues and sort of the social peer environment, coach environment issues. What's really affecting youth sports today? The first thing I'll talk about is the professionalization of youth sport. This is sort of a paradigm I think a lot of people in the real world adopt, that defines success as winning and receiving trophies and medals, attaining national rankings, or there's a lot of emphasis on chasing college scholarships today, athletic scholarships. It's often implicitly adopted by people. I sometimes think if I was a plumber where I grew up in upstate New York and I had grandkids and I was coaching, I'd watch March Madness, which is an elite, it's a wonder. I love March Madness, but it's a different venue. I'd learn how to work referees, get mad when they don't do it. I'd learn how to yell at my players sometimes. And then I'd start doing that at the youth level. Hey, elite players, it's a different ball game. It's a different approach than children, but I wouldn't get that. What I see on TV is a professionalized model, so they tend to model and adopt that at the youth level. So I think that's important. And this model leads to focus on and resources given to the most talented children. Some of the work I do with the National Wrestling Coaches Association, they're worried that a lot of high school coaches now are focusing on two really talented kids and ignoring 20 or 30 that are less talented, and roster sizes actually decrease. Premature early sports specialization and intense training is a huge problem for us, not only in terms of producing kids that can have a healthy life, but also in terms of producing elite athletes. Heavy focus on talent development and competitive success too early. Focus on external rewards, college scholarships that I mentioned. And finally, increased stress and the potential of burnout. So there's a professionalization issue. Another issue we need to know more about is the business of youth sports. There was a Time magazine article a couple years ago that talked about youth sports as a $15.3 billion industry. So if Frederick, Maryland has a soccer tournament and they bring 5,000 kids and their parents, they fill up hotel rooms. You know, so travel sports, there's a whole business. Just buying equipment, there's a whole business out there. Hey, this is the U.S. Free enterprise isn't a bad thing. So just because big business is involved in sport doesn't mean it's bad, but it does lead sometimes to some unintended consequences. For example, if I'm paying a coach, I probably can expect more from that coach than if the coach is a mom or dad volunteering. So at the youth sport industry, they worked with a private data firm to get their numbers for the Time article, but they reported a 55% increase in the sort of market and the business of youth sports. So somehow we need to be dealing with that, the pros and the cons. This leads to something that I think we've talked about indirectly today, but what I call the haves and the have-nots of youth sport. I live in a university community, Okemos, Michigan. We're the haves. Our kids have nice facilities and access. Safe places to play, they have the equipment available. I do a lot of work for the last 10 years with the Detroit Police Athletic League, and you go into some neighborhoods in Detroit, it's a much different situation. Limited access to facilities. Safety issues, either on the field or you're afraid to send your kid to walk there because of gang activity or other kind of activity in the neighborhood. Little equipment available. How do we sort of bridge those gaps? This has direct effects. Some on the left. Just was mentioned opening today, the cost to pay for play. We have data in Michigan from our high school association that shows when they do pay for play, even though they have scholarships for kids that can't pay, the numbers go down. Equipment costs, travel team costs. Indirect effects, I think, is the private sector's picked up. There's a tendency for the public sector to spend less money on sport. Access to sports medicine personnel, trainers, private coaching is happening quite regularly. These that have-nots don't have that access. And finally, it feeds into this whole professionalization of youth sport model. And finally, Mo mentioned this a little bit, the lack of metrics to judge success beyond the scoreboard. Why wouldn't you, if you watched youth sport on TV, just think about success? Because that's what we have. If you pick the paper up today, it gives you outcome. It doesn't give you character building or fitness scores. We seldom track youth sport involvement. In a lot of agencies, especially in underserved areas, the dire capacity in terms of staffing is really hard for them to track the simplest things. Seldom do programs access healthy physical and psychosocial development. I'll give you an example. We've made a great partnership with the Detroit Police Athletic League. This organization in Detroit is focused on building character in young people through athletic, academic, and leadership development programs. You can see some of the goals here. Produce young people of high character with a sense of purpose, who are healthy and engage in active lifestyles. They give back to their community and obviously work with the police, given the distrust often between the police and people in underserved communities. Now, we've worked with them for about 10 years in a partnership, and it's been beneficial to both of us. We first started helping them develop a coach's education program that they train their 1,500 volunteer coaches with. We did program evaluation studies, some of which led to publications, but more importantly, helped them show their funders. They're all funded about $2-some million a year through foundations, that they were spending the money wisely. Equally important, they also saw where the money was working and not working, so they made adjustments. We helped them develop a team-up officer training where a police officer mentors a youth sport team to try to have a better connection between the police and the young people. Dr. Ramona Cox with their staff runs a great girls leadership development program. We have a student doing her dissertation tied to that. And what I'm most excited about is the internal program evaluation capacity. Now, Detroit PAL, when we started with them, they were called Think Detroit, which had 2,000 kids. Then they merged with the PAL. Then they merged again, now they're Detroit PAL, but now they have 12,000 kids participating in Detroit, 95% kids of color. When we started, they couldn't tell you how many kids they had because they merged, and one system counted the number of kids on one software system, basketball did another, and they couldn't tell what their retention was or how many kids were in the program. So we worked with them. They got with Salesforce, which is a major platform. So now they can, I just put a general number, they have about 12,000 participants. 79% are eligible for free and reduced lunch. 1,805 volunteers. And what they do is internally, they track their major values now. So they have parents, coaches, and kids every season do assessments of where they are on teamwork. These are Likert scales that go to 5. So they score pretty well on, this was 2017, teamwork, leadership, discipline, responsibility, respect. So they can tell you their retention. What I'm really excited about is looking at dosage. If they can start tracking dosage, a kid that's in more activities with Detroit PAL over time, are they less likely to be incarcerated? Are they more likely to stay in school? What's their fitness? What's their nutrition level? Okay, let me pivot really quick because I have to be aware of time. What can the government do? And this is from a person not in the government, so I'm just going to wing it. The good news is I'm a few years from retirement, so I don't have to live with the consequences. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we have no Ministry of Sport. Most other major countries do. The UK, Canada, Australia. Little government monies are invested in youth sports. There's no funds that I know of for educating coaches or parents. Little funding for conducting research on critical issues or building capacity. So as a researcher, I'm not here just looking for money. I'd like some to do research. We need to build capacity in underserved communities. We need to build infrastructure in terms of their staff and other type of things. This, not beating around the bush. This needs to change. I don't know how the government people can figure it out, but we need to change it. Typical citizen, come stir the pot and go home. One thing I think would be really essential is to appoint someone in Washington that is in charge of youth sports and just thinks about it all day long, every day. I say that because a number of years ago, I worked with the U.S. Olympic Committee when they were starting coaching education and sports science. Nothing happened until governing bodies had somebody in that body that was responsible. Then things started to happen. To me, this person would keep current on issues in youth sports. They'd work with other government agencies for facilitating research, training, programming to maximize safe and healthy involvement. We're probably never going to have a Ministry of Sport or an Office of Sport, but work with all the other agencies to perhaps find money that could make a difference. Help provide a coordinated national strategy. I think we had a great plan for doing that today. Help facilitate involvement of private agencies. Again, it's tough. Everybody comes to Washington and thinks there's just piles of money come from the mint that's going to save everything. We got to have public-private partnerships. We've got to figure out how to do it efficiently. So I don't come here just saying, hey, just give the money and solve all the problems. It's got to be figured out. Develop national youth sport policies. I give some examples. In my lifetime, Title IX has been one of the most successful. Still have a ways to go, believe me, but we've made big gains. The Amateur Sport Act of 1978 and recently the Safe Sport Act. One of the things I think we need to rethink is what effect funded versus unfunded mandates have. For example, Title IX in a sort of a backward way was funded. The old boys would have never changed in the era I grew up in if they weren't afraid of losing all their federal funding. So there were teeth in it. The Amateur Sport Act is an unfunded mandate, at least the way I understand it, in the sense that it put the U.S. Olympic Committee in charge of sport. There's really good people that worked in the Olympic Committee. I've worked at the elite level with them. But they have to raise all their own money through individual donations and corporate donations. The way you do that is just like big universities do, by winning championships and medals. So most of their attention is focused on winning medals so they can bring the money in to stay solvent. The grassroots programs usually are sort of the leftovers in terms of time and effort. Finally, the Safe Sport Act is very important, but obviously has also been criticized because I think juvenile justice, the funds that came for it, didn't tie to being able to investigate. And there's all these other Larry Nassars around, for in other words, that we need to investigate and prevent to make sure kids are safe. Finally, we need to move beyond public awareness and relations to get in the game and maybe get involved in programming, help secure funding for programming, funding public and private, and set up institutes, a dream I would have in like ours in each state or each region that would look after sport perhaps in that region and be responsible for getting participation up or training coaches and parents. Working with existing agencies, the government should consider funding activities like coach, parent education, facilities development. And I'm going to transition real quickly to Maureen to talk about some research funding.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, and not just our research with Girls on the Run, but critical youth sport issues require substantial human resources and financial resources. These are just some of the critical youth sport issues, many others, but I cited some that kind of collaborate between sport, physical activity, cultural competence, life skills, and so forth. Unfortunately, private foundation and corporation funding is often just inadequate to really get the rigorous research done. So one of the things that I could see is mechanisms for the government to provide opportunities for funding research. Another one is RFPs targeted for sport-based research. So rarely have I ever seen something like that, or maybe never. So for example, a few years ago, NIH had an RFP for reducing risk behaviors by promoting positive youth development. This was not sport specific, but I do know people that submitted proposals with physical inactivity and obesity as a risk behavior that could be addressed using positive youth development programs. But if sport, not just physical activity or nutrition, was targeted, there would be more critical research done. Dan talked about his collaboration with Detroit PAL. I've worked with Girls on the Run and the First Tee, and we have formed successful partnerships. The government could help foster more collaborations between universities and youth sport agencies to help move us ahead. Well, I know Russ Pate is going to talk more about the National Physical Activity Plan, but I just want to point out that the National Physical Activity Plan, even though sport is one of the main sectors, all of the sectors kind of circle back to our comment about a systems approach. So we can't just affect sport participation in the sports sector. It can be addressed in the schools, in the faith-based settings, and so forth and so on. I do think I have looked at the National Physical Activity Plan, and they have many practical strategies and tactics that are realistic, they're concrete, they're very, very good, and a good start to making change. The final one I want to talk about is developing and making available a repository of resources for practitioners. Dan and I have both served on the Science Board of the President's Council in past years. In the past couple of years, I think that's been discontinued, maybe temporarily. And one of the things that we developed and continued was this research digest. And the research digest consisted of short 8-page reviews on a sport topic that was distributed widely to schools and youth organizations. And so I highlighted the one that Dan did in 2013 on developing effective youth sport coaches. So in 8 pages, individuals can read up on what are the important mechanisms. So this is my plea to bring back the Science Board and the Research Digest because it's something that's accessible, it's available, and easy to do. Youth sport practitioners tell us they want to consume the academic research, but they don't have access to it like we do in the universities with our libraries. So it would be really good if the government could help streamline or make available open access to certain research articles that youth sport practitioners can be have available to them and not have to pay. Directory of websites and contacts that youth sports organizations, this can be universities, just websites of various organizations. FAQ sheets on youth sports issues could be even a shorter version of the Research Digest that, again, we want to get the information out to youth sport practitioners on how they can make a difference with their curricula, their coach training, and their evaluation of whether their program is making an impact on outcomes as they desire. Back to Dan.
Let me finish here with just a few comments, building off this on knowledge translation and then a quick summary. We need to engage more in knowledge translation and traditional and translational science. I put this slide up. The classic research of Frank Smith and Ron Smith and Frank Small and their colleagues, done in the late 70s, did interventions to show coaches who were more positive and encouraging and less punitive, focused more on instruction, and trained, it was an intervention study, found that the kids who played for those coaches had higher self-esteem, they had lower attrition rates on the team, all these positive effects. 40 years later, most youth sport coaches don't know the effects of this study. So that tells us a big problem. How do we do this? We just recently had our 40th anniversary conference at the Institute for the Study of Youth Sports, and we brought in some of the best researchers in the world in to give summaries of the literature. And those summaries, for example, we brought someone from Canada in, how to make high school sport impactful, the role of parents, social development, giving effective feedback. These are infographics that Dr. Jenny Nalipa and our staff of students have worked on to condense those papers into one page or one screenshot, and their social media that we send out and are trying to get to the people in the real world. Now, we're pretty excited about this. We have about 8 of them going, but that's not enough. Sending some social media blast out isn't going to move the dial. But what's great is the federal government, REAIM has been around about 20 years, and NIH and others. It's a model for disseminating research and looking at reach and other sorts of things. Jim Deering's work on diffusion theory is very interesting. Diffusion theory says most normal people don't use research to guide their daily living. They live in a social system, and in that system, there's certain respected people. So a respected youth sport coach in a league. If that coach, he or she adopts it, the other coaches follow. Deering's work is sort of like targeted social marketing. You get the right people doing the right things, everybody follows. So, example, March Madness, Tom Izzo does something, a lot of basketball coaches are going to do it, as opposed to sending them a research report. That doesn't mean we don't need evidence-based practice, so that message is really important. It's how do we translate it. And in Canada, Nick Holt and his colleagues, they have a big federal grant there to do knowledge to action frameworks for knowledge translation. They're partnering with universities all over Canada to do that. So, in summary, we went a few minutes over, but thanks to Katrina for giving us a few of her minutes, so we're still on time. We tried to cover the landscape of youth sports here, talked a little bit about the history, critical issues, our thoughts on what the government could do. I just want to stop, and I think I speak on behalf of Maureen, to thank the government workers in the room for the hard work you do. I know we're not supposed to do that as citizens. We're supposed to just say you don't do nice things, but this is really important work, and it really, I've been involved in this for 40 years, and I'm excited that this could move the dial. This could really make a huge difference in kids' lives, and it has huge implications, as was said. The work we do with wrestling, the Marines are really interested because they're trying to get fit people that can enter the Marines, especially women wrestlers, which is, by the way, the fastest growing segment in wrestling is women's wrestling. And the Marines are very interested because those women are the kind of people that can pass the physical requirements to do it and the health cost. And most importantly, it can lead to better lives for millions of people. So thank you for all your efforts.
Well, thank you, Dan and Maureen, for all that great information. It was very informative. Thank you. So I know we'll have lots of questions. So the way we're going to do our questions is because the federal staff are actually gathering information and asking questions to drive the development of the strategy, we're going to ask them to ask questions first for the first 5 minutes. And then the next 10 minutes of questions will be open to the full audience. And we have two young ladies who have mics. So when I point to you, they will give you a mic, and we ask that you say your name and your affiliation before you ask your question, and we do ask that you be concise. Okay? So any questions?
How long did it take you to, should I stand?
Yep, stand, but just say your name too and your
I'm
affiliation.
sorry. I'm Chris Moore, the CEO of US Youth Soccer. I was just curious, you touched on the lack of data and insights and having to sort of cobble together insights from many different organizations. How long did it take you in going through that process? Because we struggle with the same thing.
It's tough, I think, especially if you're going at the underserved communities. The infrastructure there is just not what it is in the middle class communities. And it's very, for example, in our Detroit work, when we were involved in doing evaluations, I was afraid to do an intervention because I wasn't sure they had the staff to pull it off. So I think first is trying to, one, convince the staff that evaluation's important, and we did that. When we did our projects with them, they brought all their funders in, and we went over the results, and they saw that they weren't just happy sheets. They were like, here's what we're doing well, here's what we need to improve on, and the funders were so impressed that they followed through. So it was important. But there were also problems in convincing the staff. A lot of the athletic directors didn't want to do it because they thought it would if they didn't get good results, their job would be affected. So we had to do public relations. So I think it's setting a priority and then working with the staff and understanding the conditions and then little baby steps at a time and sort of moving forward.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and Dan touched on that. It all starts with building relationships with, between the universities, the academics and the youth sport organizations. And in evaluation research, the internal evaluations are important to start, to kind of get a feel for what's going well and what's not, and kind of be able to make those improvements, in-house, so to speak. Eventually, the third-party research, and Dan alluded to this, and I know that with Girls on the Run and with the First Tee, the third-party research resulted in more donations, funding, grants, and so forth, whether it's from corporations or foundations, because it's an independent study. So eventually, internal to external evaluation, key evaluation researchers say that organizations should address 3 questions: what, so what, and now what? What's going well, so what do we need to do, and now where do we need to go? So that's been my experience, and I'm very grateful to Girls on the Run who's here for their support, the whole time.
Rick Torano, National Institutes of Health. So a follow-up question, and both of you kind of addressed the attitudinal barriers to evaluation, the PR piece, but what about just the people to do it? Because that's something where perhaps, and I presume this is what you did, Dan, is you brought students, you brought people, you didn't ask the coaches and staff to collect data, or talk about that, please.
Yeah, for our external studies we did with them, our students collected the data and we went down and did it. For their internal evaluations, they have staff and they have interns now, and their interns go out and collect it from the children and the parents at events. So they've embedded it as part of like the infrastructure. The athletic directors now know evaluation is part of the program. Yeah, it's, and actually the example I gave before, they're really good people, but they tend to be overworked and basically underpaid. But really connecting with the athletic directors on why this was important, and then, and trying to keep the data minimal, versus so it doesn't take all day to do and those type of things.
Yeah, I ended up needing to recruit 10 former and current students to do all the data collection, and that was like flying in long distance. The issue with having coaches or maybe board of directors people and so forth to collect for an external study, of course, is the validity of the responses, especially with 8 to 11, 12-year-olds. If the coach is administering the survey, they want to please the coach. And so that's what makes the independent external, is making sure people who are an arm's distance away. So it makes it difficult. But with the funding, that of course helps solve that. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Any other federal folks?
Katrina Piercy from the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. A similar question to Rick, so I'll add a little bit of a twist. I guess seeing your comments and thinking about the evaluation piece and thinking about the academic institutions across the country that focus on sports, there's not many. You two are representing 2 of them, but I wonder if this is maybe a suggestion, seeing that some of this external research has brought more funding and things to programs, to think about if there is a local university there or there is research, maybe is that a connection that isn't made in a lot of places and might be a way to lift up on both sides for students to have an experience and maybe to get the program itself to have some data collected and then be able to disseminate or lift up. I'm wondering if that might be a suggestion or a model, if you've done it well at your institutes, something for programs to think about finding these places.
One of the things a lot of times is some of the national organizations have more than 200 chapters or councils and so forth. So yeah, sometimes a local university may want to do a study. One of the challenges with that is that it might be a study on one council or one chapter that may not be representative of the larger organization. Those are some of the barriers in research, is having a representative sample of that. But your question about trying to foster collaborations with local universities is a great one, and then encouraging, that type of sort of representative research.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add is you have to find the right people. Now, we've had a 10-year relationship with Detroit PAL, and we're not a institute that's flush with money, but we haven't been funded all those years. So we've made a commitment to them, and that's huge because they know we're there. And at big universities now, you're there when the grant's there, and then the grant's gone and you're gone. So we've made a commitment to try to be with them year in, year out. And it's been very advantageous for us. But it also takes a while to build trust. I know we did a coaching education seminar and brought their staff up. And they're primarily African-American and Hispanic, but mostly African-American. And I remember at the end of the 2-day session, we had to train these leaders. They said, I wasn't sure when we came up here we could learn anything from 2 white guys from East Lansing, but we learned a lot. But that told me something very important. First it was we're from the middle class, and now we're going in the city. And who the spokespeople are, and there's some issues that are very practical that we need to consider. But to me, it's the long-term trust, and they know we're there for each other. And it's hard because when we don't have grants, it comes out of our hides.
Next question. We'll get you next, sir.
My name's Risa Assard. I'm the Associate Director for Thought Leadership for Kaboom. Thanks so much for your great presentation and your work. You've focused a lot in this presentation. It looks like the rest of the day, too, will be really focused on what we might call like the software of youth sports, the people, the programs, the curriculum. I'm wondering if you could give a brief overview of kind of the hardware, right? Where are kids playing and who has access to play spaces? And where the data is on that and why that might be an important consideration for this sports strategy.
Yeah, I think it's a really important consideration. And again, Emily from Project Play has a pretty good handle on that, so I think that could be a good source. But it's a different world. I remember when we did our evaluation in Detroit, we went to a rundown park at the time because it was still sort of a recessive time and economically. And there were about 2,000 kids at a baseball, on the weekend. And part of our evaluation, there was one porta potty. for 2,000 people, and and the boys went behind a tree, to be honest, but the girls, I wondered what they did. Our researchers had to drive to a gas station. I was brave enough to look in the one porta potty, and it said it should have been removed 2 weeks earlier. And that was because the park districts didn't have money. So there's some real but they had fields. So that was the upside. The Wilson Foundation's doing some great work in Detroit now. They're doing some, they're rolling out a mobile sort of lab with equipment in neighborhoods. Project Play's done trying to get small places to play. So that is the actual where you play is really critical in having spaces and the safety piece.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I'm Lauren
Oh,
Darensberg.
Oh, go ahead, go ahead. This gentleman's been waiting to get in. Lauren,
So should I go?
can you wait?
Go ahead, Lauren.
Okay, he deferred.
Hi, I'm Lauren Darensberg. I'm with the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition. So you talked a lot about the benefits of participation. I'm curious if you, in your research, have a sense of if youth are actually aware of those benefits, because you mentioned, how youth can be implicitly adapting to professionalism. Do you get a sense that they're also doing that with the actual benefits of sport participation? And is that a way that we can motivate them to participate?
I'm not sure I understand your question fully, but I guess one part I would say, one of the obstacles we have is most coaches in America believe sport builds character and all these benefits, whether you do anything or not. So you catch it versus teach it. So a big thing in the educational piece is you need to be intentional. You need to have a strategy to do these things versus just, you might get some effect just showing up, but if I'm organized, I'm planful, I'm going to get bigger effects. So that's something we focused on. The kids seem to respond pretty well. Yeah, sometimes they do a professionalization, but most kids, especially at the young ages, they want to have fun, they want to be with their friends, they want to learn the skill. So we've had pretty good luck, and a lot of programs we're doing now have youth voice in it. And they bring up a lot of really good things that really, I'd recommend all programs have an athlete, young person advisory council to give them input.
Thank you. I would just add to that the part that I was presenting on the literature base, that's evidence-based using a multitude of methods, which could be focus groups, individual interviews, surveys, observational methods like Smith and Small. And so with those kinds of rigorous methods, we know those benefits are real. We also know some of the detriments are real. So the professionalization part was more of kind of at the cultural level, yeah.
Okay, we're going to take one more question.
Okay, Dan and Maureen, that was incredible. It was comprehensive, and I think a lot of practitioners on this side of the room are going to echo a lot of what you said in terms of practice and what our recommendations are. So thank you. The quick question, I'm Paul Kakamo from Up to Us Sports, is we talked about gathering data on the demographics of the kids. What about the coaches? Do we know anything about whether or not having a same gender coach has a greater impact as a credible messenger, whether a coach is from the same community, a same race? Do we know, have there been studies looking at that?
You want to go first? Yeah, there is actually a literature base on that too. Competence is the most important thing, I think, rather than gender, but there is often a modeling effect. So like with Girls on the Run, the head coaches are women to help inspire the girls and so forth. And oh, I've kind of lost my train of thought here. I'll give it over to Dan, but I was going to say that having those competent characteristics and behaviors is most important, but there's also the role modeling effect. Oftentimes it's very difficult to recruit. Recruiting women coaches is much harder than men coaches. It's still that case. Anyway, I'm rambling now.
I wish there was more literature on it, but I think, we've got data that the more coaches create caring climates, the more effects you get. Again, there's sort of a trust factor. A lot of kids in the inner city, like an adult comes, and they don't think the adult's coming back because adults in their life have been so transient. So sometimes it's sort of being there. Or if you're only there for a set amount of time, let them know that. So I think one thing we do at our institute that I think's really paid off for us, before any project with any group, we do a needs assessment. We find out what's going on the ground, what the coaches feel, do they want this? Because a lot of times the board will want it, but when you get onto the field, the coaches don't understand it or whatever, or the parents. So we try to get a needs assessment about what they want, what their concerns are, and then work from there.
I was just going to add one more thing. One of the unintended consequences of Title IX is while, participation of girls and women has exploded, the percentage of women coaches dramatically declined, so that, especially at high school and college levels. So as girls' sport became more important and more viable financially, very small percentage of women tend to be the head coaches at high schools and colleges. So that's an interesting statistic that happened.
Okay, thank you, Dan and Maureen, for all that great information. I just want to make a note that if you have a specific comment and you didn't get a chance to ask it during the session, you can send it via email to sports@hhs.gov. We just ask that you identify which panel your comment or question is affiliated with, okay? So right now we're going to take a 15-minute, we're going to take a break until 11:15. And as we said, there are restrooms in the back. There are escorts to take you there. And we'll see you at 11:15.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services at taxpayer expense.